I'm going to be picking up on a number of themes in Lynn's talk, but my own focus is going to be on human rights and Darwinism. And I don't need to tell an audience like this that historically, Darwin's theory of natural selection has been used to support political and social and economic programs all over the spectrum. So there have been Darwinisms in support of cutthroat, competitive capitalism and imperialism. There have also been socialist Darwinisms. There have been militaristic Darwinisms and pacifist Darwinisms, anti-feminist Darwinisms and feminist Darwinisms. And what I want to do briefly today is to sketch out for you how Darwin's theory of natural selection came to be used both to underwrite the concept of human rights biologically, but also to undermine it in the course of the 20th century. And my point of entry here is going to be a concept that Steven Pinker introduced near the end of his lecture yesterday, the expanding circle. As he said, it's a concept and a phrase due in the first instance to the philosopher Peter Singer, still best known for his 1975 book, Animal Liberation, which did so much to win converts to the cause, as he put it in his subtitle, of a new ethics for our treatment of animals. But Singer was driven from the beginning by Darwinian considerations, which suggested to him at least that any notion of an absolute divide between humans and non-humans, such that for some reason humans were worthy of moral regard and non-humans were not, was untenable. It was a vestige from a pre-Darwinian age, much more Descartes than Darwin. And he went on to develop his views on how to put together Darwinism and ethics in this remarkable 1981 book, The Expanding Circle. Remarkable, not least, I'd say, for two reasons. First of all, because it was from someone on the academic left who actually had positive things to say about E.O. Wilson's sociobiology. It exemplifies my earlier point about the political flexibility of Darwinism. But remarkable, too, because it offered a very original reconstruction of the moral history of humankind as a history of the progressive expansion of the circle of beings who counted as worthy of moral regard, from one's immediate kin right on outward, Singer believed, to the non-human animals. And he represented this as a history propelled by interaction between two evolutionary products. First of all, human reason, and secondly, our evolved tendencies for altruistic action. And he stayed true to that credo. He updated and reaffirmed it in the late 90s in a little book, A Darwinian Left. And the basic idea does have an impeccable Darwinian pedigree. If we go to Darwin's great book on man, one of two, but this is the more famous, his Descent of Man, we find the following passage, which I'll just read out. As man advances in civilization and small tribes are united into larger communities, the simplest reason would tell each individual that he ought to extend his social instincts and sympathies to all the members of the same nation, though personally unknown to him. This point being once reached, there is only an artificial barrier to prevent his sympathies extending to the men of all nations and races. Sympathy beyond the confines of man, that is, humanity to the lower animals, seems to be one of the latest moral acquisitions. So I think it's an intrinsically interesting and uplifting passage, but it's also had a rather interesting cultural afterlife. And I just want to draw your attention to two instances where this quotation has appeared rather instructively, one from the 20th century and one from the 21st. The 20th century instance comes from the epochal, some would say, UNESCO Statement on Race, preliminary version first published in 1950 and then subsequently revised. The only quotation from a scientific source in this document is the one that I just read to you. The only other quotation is from Confucius. So that's the league that Darwin was punching in. This document is the reason why we all now, if we talk about race at all, have to indicate we mean race in quotation marks. The message given here was that from a biological standpoint, race, in anything other than the trivial populational genetic sense, does not exist. Race, in the sense in which racism was formally supported, has no place in modern science. Thus, the document concluded. And it's not at all misleading to see it as a kind of biological warrant for the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights, promulgated in 1948, seen here with its great proponent, Eleanor Roosevelt. If we look at the preamble to the UNESCO Constitution, we see that anti-racism and science on behalf of anti-racism was part of the UN's agenda right from the start. The Great and Terrible War, this is 1945, the Great and Terrible War, which has now ended, was made possible by the denial of the democratic principles of the dignity, equality, and mutual respect of men, and by the propagation in their place, through ignorance and prejudice, of the doctrine of the inequality of men and races. And in 1949, resolutions were adopted to gather and disseminate scientific material on race. So that's the 20th century surfacing of that passage from The Descent of Man. A 21st century surfacing is in Steven Pinker's book, The Better Angels of Our Nature. The passage I read up to you, up to those ellipses, is the epigraph to the final take-home message chapter, the chapter in which, as he did last night in the lecture, he summarizes what he sees as the main historical developments which have pushed humankind towards a more peaceable existence. You'll recall the Leviathan, and the expanding circle is one of them. So given that succession from Darwin's day to our own, it would be easy to leave you with the impression that there's just been a kind of enduring consensus among clear-thinking, good-hearted Darwinians about the expanding circle and what it means. But I don't think that's the case. I'm going to argue a different thesis, that hidden beneath the surface continuity is a remarkable discontinuity. The break happens in the years around 1900. On the 19th century side, what we find is what we would now call a racist understanding of the expanding circle. Whereas on the 20th century side, we get a non-racist understanding, and one which, as such, was fit for underwriting a human rights concept, but also, I hope to show near the end, vulnerable to attack as speciesist. Speciesism was an unlovely term, in several senses, introduced by Peter Singer in Animal Liberation to indicate species prejudice. And I hope by the end to throw a little bit of light historically on how Singer came to hold the views that he does, or how his position became possible on Darwinism and ethics, with both its appealing and its less appealing sides. So to go to the 19th century now, the idea of a scale descending by degrees from the highest, whitest European civilized peoples right on down through, they would have said in the 19th century, the most savage humans, often identified as the Hottentots or the Fuegians or the Australian Aborigines, and then right on through by degrees to the highest animals. This was a pervasive idea. It predated Darwin. But Darwin, in my view, and there's more to be said about Darwin's humanitarianism, and this may come up in the discussion, but when it comes to this idea, Darwin accepted it, and indeed he, at certain points, exhibited as a virtue of his theory of natural selection that it made it intelligible. It explained it. Here's another passage from the same book where the expanding circle passage comes from. This is well known, some of you will have encountered it. At some future period, not very distant as measured by centuries, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace throughout the world the savage races, while also exterminating the anthropomorphous apes too. The break will then be rendered wider, for it will intervene between man and a more civilized state, as we may hope, than the Caucasian, i.e. the one at the top, and some ape as low as a baboon, instead of at present between the Negro or Australian and the gorilla. And if you were to try to visualize the expanding circle under this conception, I think you could do worse than think of the lid of this rather fetching pot. So think of vertically tiered concentric rings, where each reaching out is also a reaching down. this is the 19th century conception, and this is what is about to disappear. We come now to that break I mentioned, and for purposes of today, I'm calling it the Great Evolutionary Leveling and Distancing. What happens in the years around 1900 is that all human races are raised up biologically, in conceptual terms, to the level of the highest. All are declared biologically equal. All differences between them declared to be due to history, not to biology. This leveling up is at the same time a distancing and a pushing down of the non-human from the human. All humans are now equally distant, or to put another way, equally far from the non-human, which is now a long way down from anything human. We have a cultural survival from this leveling, distancing moment in our culture. The famous factoid about Eskimo words for snow comes from just this moment. It comes from the writings of the great German-born American anthropologist Franz Boas, notably his pivotal 1911 book, The Mind of Primitive Man. It's not often recognized that Boas was making an anti-racist point in bringing up the now much disputed example of the Eskimo words for snow. Boas founded American anthropology as a repudiation of anything like European race-ranking anthropology, and Darwinism along with it. And part of that involved taking on the race rankers who would typically say that primitive peoples would be primitive in their languages too. And they would typically have one fuzzily semantic word, where more advanced cultures would have lots of different words of precise meaning. And Boas's answer to that was that each culture will have fuzzily semantic words and topics on which you get lots of different precisely differentiated words. It depends on the interests of that culture. Snow is of interest to the Eskimo. They have more words. And likewise, here the Eskimo are talking about suburban white males having 100 words for lawn. But the point initially was part of his anti-racist polemics. Boas, when in relation to Darwinian theory, is a bit of a funny case. He's maybe what we would now call a critical friend. Rather awkwardly, he was invited in 1909 to take part in Columbia University's celebrations in the Darwin anniversary of that year. And it's awkward reading because he clearly doesn't have a lot to say that's friendly toward Darwin. He thought Darwin got some big things right, but he got some big things wrong, not least in his insistence that some humans were closer to the animals in their bodies and minds than others. Boas thought that was fundamentally mistaken. So the question arises, what became of this Boasian view? How does it become integrated into the Darwinism that we know? And the short answer is through his last PhD student, Ashley Montague, British-born American anthropologist. Some of you of a certain generation might remember him as Johnny Carson's favorite anthropologist. This is an image from one of his early TV appearances. He took on Boas's scientific anti-racism through the 30s and 40s, promoted it in a very good book called Man's Most Dangerous Myth. And he was hired to be the rapporteur at the UNESCO meetings that produced the race statement. And he took that opportunity to build in Darwinian views on human evolution that he had collaborated on with none other than Theodosius Dobzhansky, one of the most important Darwinian biologists of the 20th century. In 1947, they published a paper showing that, or arguing, that natural selection had selected for what they called educability in humans, plasticity. So humans were biologically uniform in having been selected for the ability to be educable. So a biological basis was hereby given to the cultural diversity that Boasian anthropologists made their object of study. And this shows up in the UNESCO race statement, Clause 10. After explaining that it's not different genes but different histories that account for differences in cultural achievements of different groups, we read, "The one trait which above all others has been at a premium in the evolution of men's mental characters has been educability, plasticity. This is a trait which all human beings possess. It is indeed a species character of Homo sapiens." So we've reached the point where Darwinian natural selection has underwritten the concept of human rights. But we see it does so at the cost of insisting on the species membership as the source of those rights. And now we come back to Peter Singer. Racism was not Singer's battle. I think from his point of view, that had already been won. he was bothered rather by this insistence that there was something privileged, somehow metaphysically magical about being human, such that rights accrued to you, but not to other kinds of being. And it's worth reflecting a little bit on at least one non-controversial definition of what human rights might be from Lynn Hunt's historical book. Human rights require three interlocking qualities. Rights must be natural, equal, and universal. And then she says, for rights to be human rights, all humans everywhere in the world must possess them equally, and only because of their status as human beings. Well, as a utilitarian philosopher, Singer was suspicious of rights talk, but as a Darwinian utilitarian, he was particularly incensed by the idea that being human somehow made for moral specialness. And that has led him in directions that many of us find appealing, directions that are not always appealing. So it's led him to be against factory farms, but it has also led him to suggest that euthanasia for severely disabled infants might be appropriate in some cases. So his is one vision of what a post-human rights world looks like when you take Darwinian considerations seriously. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
So many thanks to both our panelists for these very rich presentations. I think in the first panel we heard a sort of longue durée structural story that was quite optimistic about the prospects. And we had a somewhat more historically contextualized account, or a more middle-term historicized account that nevertheless did span centuries. And I think what came out more in this panel has been a tension that ran through both of your presentations of the sort of emancipatory work that the human does, and at the same time the way that the dirty underbelly, as it were, of the category of the human and how it's been used in ways instrumentalized and in ways that its purveyors sincerely believed were reasonable, such as the designation of humans as savages, the dirty work that the category of human has done. So I think that may be a tension that will be discernible in some of the questions. I open the floor to anyone who wants to pick up on that that angle, or to, of course, any other aspect of this very rich set of remarks.